how can low carb athletes perform just as well as high carb athletes based on this newest data that you have available to you?
Yeah, so the data. So let's dive into the data first. Like, what was the data and where did it come from? So we looked at Ironman completers, individuals who completed a full or half Ironman, who were actively engaging in training towards that competitive endeavor, and were very fit, healthy individuals, high training volumes. That was the inclusion criteria for the study. But the goal of the study itself was to look at the difference between someone who was undergoing well over 350 grams of carbohydrates per day upon, I believe the number was around 360 grams on average for the athletes, compared to a very low carbohydrate diet, which is around 50 or less grams of carbohydrates per day. So this ketogenic category. And we were interested in that because for years there had been this predominant belief that high carbohydrate diets were superior for performance. There was data that had showed that muscle glycogen, as it got lower and lower and lower, was associated with fatigue. So obviously, how do you restore muscle glycogen? You consume things that turn into glucose. So carbohydrates is a key form of that, right? So more carbohydrates, more muscle glycogen. And there was also belief that carbohydrate oxidation, because of the efficiency per unit of oxygen consumed in carbohydrates, was high, that would be a superior fuel source, particularly for high intense exercise. We're maintaining that over a long duration. And so these two beliefs, not only the ability to maintain muscle glycogen levels, but also the ability to maintain high levels of carbohydrate oxidation as a result of enhanced muscle glycogen storage, were both not only associated with performance, were believed to be essential for performance. And that was further reinforced by these short-term studies in diverse athletes group, all the way from elite to highly trained to recreational, showing that if you were to do a low carbohydrate approach for 3 weeks or less, you would see performance decline. So all this evidence was accumulating to say you should consume high carbohydrate diets. But there was these studies all the way back to the 1960s and 70s by a gentleman named George Cahill. And people often don't pay attention to this work, but it's paramount and essential to how you study these diets, because these studies had illustrated that even in the most potent stimulus of metabolic change, something like a fast over a period of time, that key metabolites in the form of, let's say, ketone bodies or glucose-based changes, some of these metabolites do not only reach their peak levels at high or low levels, so the peak change, and then normalize for at least 3 weeks or more. And what that's telling us is that homeostasis on when you shift to a carbohydrate restricted approach is probably not normalized within the first 3 weeks. And there had also been data in the 1980s from a pioneer in the low carb space and exercise, a gentleman named Steve Phinney, who actually looked at athletes. And we've had multiple dinners where we sat down and talked about this extensively, actually even before this paper had come out in preparation for this work. And he would describe all the way back to then. He's like, it was so fascinating because he's an avid cyclist himself. He said, I would ride alongside these highly trained cyclists, really highly trained individuals. They were high performers, and I would race alongside them, and I would find that, before they started any diet, they would blow right past me. And then as they initiated the diet, the first 1, 2, and almost around 3 week time frame, I would be blowing right past them. It was easy to go past them, and they would be trailing me. He said at the week 4 time point, all of a sudden they just start swooping right past me again. And so he said there was something unique and essential to this timeline around the 4-week mark. Now, we were very interested in that because all this evidence, including from premier labs around the world, and even in elite athletes, were looking at timelines much shorter than that. 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 week, with this idea that, well, look, we see the elevations in ketone bodies, which is an indication of achieving ketogenesis. We see bodies shift from carbohydrate oxidation towards fat oxidation. We see insulin lower, we see glucose lower, and all of that is happening within the first week, 1 to 3 weeks. So obviously it should be sufficiently long to actually look at keto adaptive athletes. The problem is that it didn't account for these earlier studies going back almost 50 years prior to any of these analyses, which were showing that there was no ability to maintain homeostasis of metabolites, a key indicator of metabolic homeostasis after a diet change, for at least 3 weeks or more. So we actually embarked on a study before this one where we looked at runners who were running up to 50 kilometers per week, very low body fat, high VO2 maxes, very fit. And we put them on a low carbohydrate diet or a high carbohydrate diet for 4 weeks. And they were on the same diet. So same subject, they crossed over. In total, they were on the whole intervention for a total of 10 weeks. So, very, very impressive research subject. And we did some important things, Derek. We controlled physical activity, we controlled calories, and we controlled body weight in that study, something that most of these studies don't do, because physical activity, caloric change, and other changes alongside those factors, including body weight, can manipulate and alter performance. But our goal was not to look at all these composite variables and how they change. Our goal was to look at the macronutrient specific effect on performance. And so what we did is maintained all these variables over both diets and assessed high intense exercise, north of 85% of VO2 max. We asked subjects to go to a 1 mile time trial, go as fast as you can. Now, most of your listeners probably appreciate this, but the average person out there, if you've never tried to go full blast for 1 mile, you might not appreciate how brutal that actually can be. But a 1 mile time trial is incredibly hard. It's like the ultimate mental test. It's long enough to suck. It's hard enough to be extremely brutal, and long enough for you really to have to be able to maintain a high level of pain and intensity to maintain that. But we also got them to do 6 by 800 meter sprints. So 2 forms of very high intense exercise, asked them to go as fast as they could in both endeavors. There was no difference in performance outcomes from individuals who had very low carbohydrates versus very high carbohydrates in that study. And so it led to this question of, well, in this type of very high intense, short duration exercise, which the exercise science field has predominantly believed is very glycolytic, we saw no differences in performance. So what accounted for that? Well, what accounted for that was we were measuring substrate oxidation. And we saw that athletes, even north of 85% of their VO2 max, were oxidizing record levels of fat that had never been recorded. So we actually recorded the highest ever levels of fat oxidation in the literature, north of 1.5 grams per minute. At levels north of 85% of VO2 max, for your listeners who are unaware, that's a level of intensity that you'd expect fat oxidation to be near zero. There's something called the crossover point or crossover concept, that as intensity increases with exercise, you start using more carbohydrates and less fat under the set principles that carbohydrates can be oxidized at limited levels of oxygen, whereas fat requires oxygen to be metabolized, or at least predominantly. And as a result, as you get more intense, you would lose your ability, your body would shift away from the fat to carbs. But we did not see that. What we actually saw was a record level of fat oxidation in these subjects that had never been recorded before, illustrating that fat oxidation could actually maintain performance at this extremely high level. And I want to get back to that point a little bit later when actually looking at world record setters in Ironman events, where they've actually shown that fat oxidation becomes the predominant fuel substrate, even in the world's best, and they maintain performance, regardless of how many carbohydrates they're consuming, as long as exercise long enough. But that's a side note. We can come back to that. The study we just undertook was a follow-on to that. There was much criticism in this original study saying, well, yeah, okay, that's interesting. That's a short duration exercise bout, very high intensity, but there's no way athletes who are at even higher levels than that would be able to, one, maintain performance, a strenuous exercise performance for a prolonged period of time. Why would they think this? Well, they would think this because there was a belief that carbohydrate oxidation was essential to maintain exercise performance over long duration. It was also believed that glycogen was essential to optimal performance. So as a result, if you do a low carbohydrate diet, you would, one, clearly lower carbohydrate oxidation, but also two, it's reliably shown to reduce muscle glycogen levels in the short term. And short term meaning even if you adapt to 4 to 6 weeks, every study less than 12 weeks in duration in athletes has shown muscle glycogen reduction or the reduction in muscle glycogen. The meaningfulness is in question, and I'll get to that in a minute. But our goal was to do 2 diverse diets in these prolonged strenuous exercise bout that we know would induce hypoglycemia. That was an essential component to this study, Derek. The reason that is because we know that carbohydrate oxidation is believed to be associated with performance, and so is muscle glycogen. But all the way back to 1921 in the Journal of American Medical Association, the very first illustration of what is now called bonking or hitting the wall was shown. Medical doctors in Boston during the Boston Marathon assessed marathoners, a cohort of marathoners going through the race. And what they found was that many of these marathoners presented with shakiness, irritability, inability, like they call it stupor, so slurred words, a seemingness of lack of cognition. What they were actually describing was something called hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia is the reduction in blood glucose to a threshold that is known to reduce brain energy metabolism. And after that study, they said, okay, well, we're seeing low glucose levels. Let's give carbohydrates. And lo and behold, it did increase glucose levels and they performed better. So in our study, literally about a century later, what our goal was with this is to get Ironman completers. So people who were completing, very, very grueling, prolonged exercise duration bouts, who are training at very high levels, get them to come in and do 2 distinct diets. One diet that's very low in carbohydrates that we know would reduce carb oxidation, reduce muscle glycogen, versus a high carbohydrate diet, and see which one would perform better, and also do it in a hitting the wall intervention or assessment where they would actually experience hypoglycemia. The reason we need these highly trained athletes who were competing and used to these very long duration exercise bouts is because in order to see meaningfully in a laboratory setting these hypoglycemic moments, you needed to go long enough. So sometimes up to 2 hours. And some of these athletes were going as long as 4 hours. And so what we were trying to uncouple here, Derek, was the essential nature of either carbohydrate oxidation, muscle glycogen, or hypoglycemia as key determinants of exercise performance. What we found is that when you looked at high carb versus very low carbohydrate ketogenic diets, there was no difference in prolonged strenuous exercise performance. What that told us is, first, if the low carbohydrate diet did in fact reduce carbohydrate oxidation and increase fat oxidation, and these diets reliably reduce muscle glycogen, but they had the same performance, this brings into question whether carbohydrate oxidation and muscle glycogen are essential key determinants of exercise performance. But what we also saw is that every athlete experienced a blood glucose drop during exercise, and the vast majority of them experienced technical hypoglycemia, which is less than 70 milligrams per deciliter or 3.9 millimolars of glucose in the blood. Everyone is a little different in where they experience these symptoms of hypoglycemia, but it's more so about the drop in glucose than it is per se a threshold effect because everyone responds differently. What we found was after we assessed the difference between diet, in order to isolate out whether exercise-induced hypoglycemia was the key determinant of exercise performance, we then had to provide carbohydrates because carbohydrates have been shown to reliably elevate glucose. But what we did in this study is we didn't provide 60 to 120 grams per hour, which is the common gold standard recommendation. Some people are even going north of this, which we can talk about. We gave 2.5 teaspoons of sugar per hour. 2.5 teaspoons, 6 to 12 times lower than these current recommended levels of carbohydrates. that low level of glucose, so 10 grams per hour or 3.4 grams every 20 minutes, was sufficient to improve exercise performance in both diets on average 22%. But there was no difference between these diets. Even though there was differences in carb oxidation, we know that there's differences in these diets in muscle glycogen levels. The one thing that this carb supplementation did was mitigate, completely eliminate exercise-induced hypoglycemia. So what this illustrated to us is that exercise-induced hypoglycemia in this particular study was the key determinant of exercise performance. And it brought into question, as has multiple prior studies that we have done and so have others, the essential nature of carbohydrate oxidation and muscle glycogen for high level performance, both in short, high duration, short, very high intense exercise bout, but also in this most recent study in Ironman completers, prolonged strenuous exercise performance.